black woman was slapped, cuffed, and dragged into court like a criminal, but when she stood up 15 minutes later, the entire courtroom froze. The courthouse steps were already alive with the shuffle of shoes and the low murmur of voices as the city stirred awake. Officers in crisp uniforms stood by the entrance, arms crossed, their eyes scanning the crowd for anyone who didn't look like they belonged. Through those stone pillars walked Kesha Williams. She wasn't dressed like a judge. Not today. No robe, no bench to elevate her above the noise, just a simple navy blouse, a neat skirt, and the leather briefcase that held her case files for the morning. She looked like any other woman on her way to work, except she carried herself with a quiet composure that drew notice even when she wasn't trying to be seen. Officer Martinez noticed. He saw her approaching and stepped forward, a sneer curling his lip before she had even spoken a word. His eyes narrowed as though he had found an intruder in his domain. Another one of them, he thought, another face he could dismiss with a flick of his wrist. He let her come close enough that she had to stop short, close enough that his shadow fell across her. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. Kesha met his eyes but didn't answer right away. Her silence only made his sneer widen. He leaned closer, his voice louder now so that the people near the doors could hear. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in here." The words were deliberate, each one laced with venom, calculated to cut. A couple of his fellow officers chuckled, already pulling their phones from their pockets, ready to capture whatever humiliation came next. Martinez took his time. He circled her slowly, his gaze traveling from her clothes to her shoes to the briefcase in her hand, as if every detail confirmed the story he was already telling himself. "Dressed like you've got business here," he said, shaking his head with mock disbelief. "Carrying papers you probably stole, thinking you can just walk up these steps like you matter." His voice was sharp, but his movements were measured, savoring the performance. He wanted the crowd to watch, wanted them to see what happened when someone like her forgot her place. Then, without warning, his hand shot out. The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed off the courthouse stone. Her head snapped sideways, and the briefcase flew from her grasp. Papers exploded into the air, fluttering down like confetti at a celebration no one asked for. Gasps rose from the crowd, followed quickly by laughter from the officers who had been waiting for this moment. Martinez pressed his advantage. He shoved her back against the cold wall, his forearm across her chest, his face inches from hers. "Filthy animals like you don't belong anywhere near this courthouse," he hissed again, louder now. The words were ugly, but the ugliness wasn't new. It was the same script he had used before, the same script the system let him repeat again and again. He wrenched her arms behind her back, snapping cold metal around her wrists. The sound of the cuffs locking echoed almost as loud as the slap had. Phones rose higher now, recording her bruised face, her scattered papers, the image of her body pinned against stone. People moving past slowed to watch. Some shook their heads, some whispered. Some turned away, but none stepped in. To them, it was just another scene outside another courthouse. A woman who should have known better, being taught a lesson by authority. Kesha's jaw throbbed, the taste of copper in her mouth, but her eyes never left the bronze nameplate above the doors. The Honorable Judge K. Williams presiding, 20 feet away her courtroom, 20 feet away her seat of authority, and here she was, beaten and cuffed like a criminal on her own steps. Yet even as Martinez pushed her forward, parading her toward the entrance with his grip iron-tight on her arm, there was no panic in her expression. No pleading, no shouting, only the steady calm of someone who knew a truth the others didn't. The crowd saw humiliation. Martinez saw dominance, but anyone paying close attention might have noticed the faintest curve at the corner of her lips, a silent promise of what was yet to come. The courtroom smelled of old wood and polished brass, a place meant for order but heavy that morning with something else entirely. Spectators filled the gallery, shuffling in their seats, curious eyes darting toward the woman at the defendant's table. Her wrists bore the red marks of handcuffs, her cheeks swollen purple where a slap had landed, and yet she sat upright, silent, a brief shadow of dignity clinging to her posture. Officer Martinez stood at the witness stand, adjusting his uniform like a man rehearsing a role he had played many times before. His voice carried easily, confident and smooth, weaving a story so polished it almost sounded believable. He told the court he had intercepted a suspicious individual attempting to breach security at the courthouse. He painted a picture of a woman dressed inappropriately, carrying documents that did not belong to her. He described erratic behavior, escalating aggression, profanity hurled in the face of lawful commands. His tone was practiced righteousness, the same cadence of authority that had convinced 100 judges before. Judge Harrison, pale and thin in his 60s, leaned forward with interest. His eyes flicked between Martinez and the bruised woman seated at the table, but it was clear where his sympathies lay. Each nod of approval felt like another nail, sealing the narrative Martinez was constructing. From the gallery, Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged glances before stepping forward to corroborate. Their uniforms were immaculate, their testimony delivered with the crisp precision of men who knew exactly what story they were supposed to tell. They repeated Martinez's script almost word for word, as though truth was something they had practiced the night before. Their words stacked one atop the other until the lie became a fortress too tall for anyone to scale. The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, added her weight to the pile. She listened to the officer's claims and nodded with sympathetic understanding, her pen scratching across her legal pad as if she had already written the charges. Trespassing, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. Each word slid into the record like stone slabs closing over a tomb. Every time Martinez's voice rose with indignation, Walsh's head tilted in agreement, reinforcing the illusion of credibility. The room seemed to lean in their direction. Authority feeding authority, lie reinforcing lie. Yet in the back row, a clerk frowned. Something in the details did not sit right. Her eyes lingered on the woman at the defense table, on the way she held herself with a composure that seemed out of place for someone accused of chaos. Another staff member shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with a colleague, but said nothing. The weight of the system pressed heavy, and no one dared interrupt the performance unfolding before them. Martinez reached for his phone, swiping to a video that began mid-scuffle. Conveniently, it showed only blurred motion and muffled shouting, with Kesha already restrained. He told the judge his body camera had malfunctioned, an excuse delivered so smoothly it slipped past unchallenged. Judge Harrison nodded gravely, noting the evidence as though it sealed the matter. The stenographer's fingers clattered, recording every word, every falsehood, enshrining them as part of the official record. The gallery murmured softly. Whispers of agreement from courthouse staff who had heard variations of this story countless times. A black woman resisting authority, a dutiful officer maintaining order. It was a story they recognized, a story that fit too easily into the grooves carved by years of repetition. Each approving nod, each sympathetic glance from the prosecutor, each echo from Martinez's fellow officers tightened the noose around the silent defendant. From where she sat, Kesha could hear every word. She remained motionless, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap despite the bruises. To anyone watching casually, she looked like a trapped woman with no way out. But for those who watched closer, for the few clerks who dared, there was something unnerving in the way her gaze never wavered, in the way her silence seemed not like defeat, but like a storm gathering beneath still water. Martinez, however, saw none of this. He was too busy basking in his own performance. To him, it was already won. Another case where the system believed his word over hers, another example of the balance of power holding steady. The officers beside him smirked with quiet certainty. The prosecutor shuffled her papers, ready to push for charges. And Judge Harrison, seated in the chair of judgment, looked at Kesha Williams not as a colleague or a citizen, but as a defendant to be processed. One more file to be stamped and filed away. The courtroom had become a theater of lies, and every actor was playing their part. For the woman in chains, the scene was suffocating. For the viewers of this story, it was infuriating. But beneath the suffocating weight of falsehood, something else stirred, unseen by most. Because if the system thought it had silenced her, it was about to learn how quickly silence can turn into the most devastating voice in the room. The defendant's chair was hard, its wooden arms digging into her sides, but Kesha Williams sat straight-backed as though she had chosen that seat for herself. Her wrists still bore the cuffs, faint red lines circling her skin where the steel had bitten. A bruise bloomed across her cheek, purple and angry, but her eyes told another story entirely. They were calm, too calm, and in that calmness was a sharpness that unsettled anyone who dared hold her gaze for too long. Around her, the performance continued. Martinez paced with swagger, feeding the courtroom his narrative like a priest delivering gospel. He described her as unhinged, belligerent, dangerous. He painted her as a threat to the very institution of justice, and each word seemed to settle like a stone in the record. Yet Kesha did not interrupt, did not object, did not even flinch. Silence became her weapon, though no one recognized it yet. To the casual observer, she looked beaten down. To those watching more closely, the silence was not submission, it was calculation. Martinez thrived on it. He mistook her stillness for weakness and pressed harder, his words dripping with contempt. He leaned toward her, voice loud enough to echo across the chamber. Another welfare queen thinking she's above the law. The insult hung in the air, ugly and casual, like something he had said 1,000 times before. A few in the gallery smirked uncomfortably. Others shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. The prosecutor scribbled notes as if the words were fact. Judge Harrison frowned in feigned solemnity, and the stenographer's keys clattered on, immortalizing the slur in the court record. But in the back, the young law clerk stiffened. Her pen froze mid-sentence, her brow furrowing. Something about the officer's tone, the arrogance in his repetition, scratched at her memory. She had heard language like this before, in whispered complaints dismissed as unsubstantial. Her eyes flicked to the defendant, to the way she sat with a stillness that felt rehearsed, as if she knew something no one else in the room did. Near the door, Bailiff Henderson crossed his arms, his heavy frame leaning against the wall. He had worked these halls for over a decade and had seen plenty of defendants break under pressure. They cried, they shouted, they begged. But this woman, she sat like stone, her jaw set, her gaze fixed on something beyond the courtroom itself. Henderson narrowed his eyes. He couldn't place it yet, but something about her didn't match the story being told from the witness stand. Martinez, oblivious, kept going. He talked of her supposed aggression, her refusal to comply, her profanity. Each lie rolled smoother than the last, the rhythm of a man who had spun this web too many times to count. Every sentence drew nods from Judge Harrison, every accusation recorded as though etched into marble. The gallery's atmosphere thickened. For those who believed the officer, the silence of the woman confirmed her guilt. For those who doubted, the silence teased them with a mystery they couldn't yet unravel. The tension wound tighter, each second pulling the rope further until it threatened to snap. Kesha remained unmoving, her breathing steady, her gaze unbroken. She didn't need to defend herself now. The courtroom could drown in his lies for a little while longer. Every insult, every fabricated detail was being catalogued, and she let it pile higher and higher, waiting for the moment when the weight of it all would collapse under its own falsity. The silence was unbearable to watch. It made the air hum, made the audience lean forward in their seats, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to shout or cry or beg. But she gave them nothing, only stillness, only the faintest glint in her eyes, sharp as steel, a quiet reminder that storms don't announce themselves until they are ready to strike. Martinez mistook her quiet as surrender, and that mistake was already sealing his fate. What the courtroom saw as weakness was the gathering of force. Her silence was not an end. It was the calm before something no one in that room was prepared to face. When the prosecutor finished, the room seemed to settle into the quiet certainty of a foregone conclusion. Papers shuffled, pens scratched, and Judge Harrison's gavel tapped once against the bench as if to signal the inevitable. Then he turned his eyes toward the defendant's table. "Miss Williams, you may respond." The invitation was perfunctory, little more than a formality before the sentencing he was already composing in his mind. All eyes shifted to the woman in chains. Kesha Williams rose slowly. The cuffs clinked against the wooden table, an echo that carried through the chamber like a challenge. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she stood still, letting the silence stretch, forcing every gaze in the room to lock onto her. The pause was intentional. A courtroom trained to listen to authority suddenly found itself hanging on the breath of someone they believed powerless. She scanned the gallery, her eyes sweeping over the officers, the clerks, the stenographer, and finally resting on Judge Harrison himself. Only then did she begin, her voice low and steady, carrying the clarity of someone who had spoken in such rooms 1,000 times before. "With respect, Your Honor, I need to address several inaccuracies in Officer Martinez's testimony." The words cut through the air like glass. The gallery stilled. Pens froze above paper. Even Martinez, leaning smugly against the rail, shifted slightly at the tone. Kesha raised her bruised face toward the bench. "Officer Martinez claims I was trespassing on government property, yet I was walking on a public sidewalk leading to the main entrance of this courthouse at 8:47 this morning. As I'm sure you're aware, Your Honor, the Supreme Court has ruled in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings remain traditional public forums protected under the First Amendment." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Harrison blinked, caught off guard by the precision of her reference. She did not let the moment fade. "He also alleged I carried stolen documents. If the court would examine the evidence table, you'll see those documents are authentic legal materials, pending case files, memoranda, administrative correspondence. documents to which I have legitimate access in my professional capacity. She let that phrase hang in the air. The ambiguity of professional capacity, twisting uncomfortably in the minds of those listening. The prosecutor frowned, flipping through her notes, suddenly less sure of the script she had been following. Kesha continued, her cadence calm, deliberate. Officer Martinez testified that I was verbally aggressive. I will invoke my Fifth Amendment right regarding statements I may have made. However, I note for the record that any words spoken were in direct response to being physically assaulted without warning, provocation, or legal justification. The law clerk in the back row sat straighter, recognition flickering across her face. She had heard seasoned attorneys command less authority in their opening statements. Bailiff Henderson tilted his head, the doubt he had felt earlier now pressing harder against his chest. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. And regarding Officer Martinez's claim that his body camera malfunctioned, Kesha said, her voice tightening. This courthouse is equipped with high-definition surveillance cameras at 15-foot intervals along the main entrance. Additionally, the county's body cam system automatically uploads backup data every 60 seconds. I am confident this court will have access to comprehensive evidence of this morning's events, regardless of his equipment failure. Martinez's smirk faltered. Color drained from his face as the implication sank in. Kesha's voice remained composed, even gentle, but each word landed with the weight of precedent, statute, and constitutional law. She was no longer the silent defendant absorbing abuse. She was a surgeon dissecting every lie, exposing the rot beneath the surface. Your Honor, she said finally, I stand before you accused of trespass, theft, and aggression, yet the evidence, when viewed in its entirety, will show something very different. It will show an officer who made assumptions, who escalated without cause, and who now seeks to cloak his misconduct in the language of order and safety. She folded her hands, the cuffs clinking again, but this time they did not sound like chains. They sounded like punctuation. The room was silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Those who had nodded along with Martinez now found themselves staring at the woman with a dawning realization. There was authority in her posture, knowledge in her words, and something in her tone that felt unmistakably like command. Martinez tried to scoff, but the sound caught in his throat. For the first time, cracks appeared in his polished performance. The twist was subtle but undeniable. The supposed trespasser spoke like she belonged in that courtroom more than any of them, and though no one yet knew her truth, they could all feel it in their bones. This was no ordinary defendant. This was someone who knew the law as intimately as she knew her own name, and her silence until now had not been surrender. It had been strategy. The storm had finally chosen to speak. The gavel's echo still lingered when Judge Harrison announced a short recess. The courtroom emptied into murmurs and whispers, but in a small holding room behind the chamber, the air was still. Kesha Williams sat quietly, her wrists red where the cuffs had been removed, her mind steady as stone. A knock rattled the door. Bailiff Henderson entered, his hands trembling as he carried a garment bag and a small wooden box. He set them down with a reverence that made the room feel like a sanctuary. Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel. His voice cracked with the weight of recognition. For 12 years he had seen her stride through these halls, never once in chains. To see her humbled and bruised had been a wound to his own conscience. Now he moved quickly, pulling out the flowing black robes trimmed with gold, the fabric heavy with years of authority. Kesha stood, slipping her arms into the sleeves. As the robes settled across her shoulders, her posture transformed. The quiet dignity that had unnerved some in the courtroom now hardened into the unmistakable aura of command. She reached into the wooden box and lifted the gavel, its handle engraved with the words "Justice is blind, but she sees all." The weight of it felt familiar in her hand, as though it had been waiting all morning to return to her grip. Henderson's breath caught. He had doubted his eyes earlier, but there was no denying the truth now. The woman brutalized on the courthouse steps was not some intruder. She was the rightful authority of that very courtroom. Time ticked down. 15 minutes was nearly gone. Henderson straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. Are you ready, Your Honor? Kesha looked at him, the bruise on her cheek still vivid, but her eyes burning with purpose. More ready than they are, she said softly. Together they walked toward the chamber doors. Inside, the spectators had returned to their seats, buzzing with gossip. Some chuckled about the defendant's bold legal references, others speculated how quickly Judge Harrison would hand down a sentence. Martinez lounged at the prosecutor's table, whispering to Walsh, his smirk back in place. He had convinced himself her performance had been nothing more than a desperate act. He could not imagine the truth that was about to walk through the door. The bailiff raised his staff, his voice booming with a command that made the walls themselves vibrate. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding. The room froze. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, every person stood. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, the sound of an entire courtroom obeying words they did not yet understand. The side door opened. Kesha Williams stepped inside, cloaked in the black robes trimmed with gold. Her gavel glinted under the overhead lights. She moved with a measured pace, the kind of walk that came not from arrogance but from years of authority. The gallery gasped as recognition rippled through the crowd. Faces turned pale, jaws dropped. The prosecutor's pen slipped from her fingers. Judge Harrison, still seated behind the bench he thought was his, went rigid. His face drained of color as he realized he had been presiding in a chair that did not belong to him. Martinez's smirk shattered. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stood frozen, caught between disbelief and terror. Silence in the room was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Kesha reached the bench, turned, and looked out over the courtroom. Every eye followed her. She sat down slowly, deliberately, her robes falling into place like armor. She lifted the gavel and set it on the bench before her, the sound sharp as thunder in the suffocating quiet. Her gaze swept across the room, from the officers who had mocked her to the prosecutor who had nodded along to lies, to Judge Harrison still standing awkwardly at the side of the bench, unsure whether to sit or flee. Then her eyes locked on Martinez. His face was gray, his hands trembling. For the first time in his career he had no script to follow. "You may be seated," Kesha said, her voice calm but carrying the full weight of authority. Chairs creaked as the courtroom lowered themselves, though not a single person looked comfortable. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. The defendant in chains had become the judge on the bench. The illusion Martinez had spun so confidently had collapsed in front of everyone. What moments earlier had looked like certain victory now felt like a death sentence delivered by silence. In that moment, the truth stood undeniable. The woman he had slapped, chained, and humiliated was not just another face to dismiss. She was the Honorable Judge Kesha Williams, and this was her courtroom. The courtroom was no longer the same chamber it had been 15 minutes before. The defendant's chair sat empty, abandoned, while the woman who had occupied it now presided from the bench. Judge Kesha Williams adjusted the robe on her shoulders, lifted her gavel, and with a single strike brought the room to heel. All eyes were on her, some wide with awe, others tight with dread. Officer Martinez sat stiffly at the prosecutor's table, his swagger gone. His hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. The silence pressed against him like a weight. Kesha spoke evenly, her voice neither raised nor rushed, yet every syllable carried across the chamber. "Officer Martinez, approximately 2 hours ago you gave testimony under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall that testimony?" Martinez swallowed hard, nodding. His words came out in fragments, almost inaudible. "Why, yes, Your Honor." Kesha's eyes narrowed slightly. "Let me refresh your memory." She tapped the tablet on her bench. The overhead screens flickered to life, and suddenly the courtroom was staring at footage from courthouse security camera number 7. There was no mistaking what they saw. Kesha walking calmly toward the building, Martinez stepping into her path, his sneer, his words. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Then came the slap, sharp and brutal, her head snapping sideways as the briefcase burst open. Gasps filled the gallery. The sound that followed silenced the room completely. Martinez's voice, captured in crisp audio, hissed through the speakers, "Filthy animals like you belong in cages." The words hung in the air, venomous and undeniable. Martinez shifted in his seat, his face draining of color. Walsh, the prosecutor who had nodded along to his testimony earlier, fumbled with her papers, her hands trembling as sheets scattered across the table. Rodriguez and Thompson, seated behind him, wiped sweat from their brows, their eyes darting to the exits as if they were calculating escape routes. Judge Harrison, who had lent authority to the lies, stood awkwardly to the side, his face ashen. He didn't wait for permission. He slipped out the side door, his robes trailing behind him like a retreating shadow. Kesha paused the video. The still frame showed Martinez's hand raised in mid-strike, his mouth twisted in contempt. She turned her gaze to him. "Officer Martinez, do you see any aggression in this footage? Any profanity, any threats?" Martinez opened his mouth, but no words emerged. The silence was worse than a confession. "You testified that your body camera malfunctioned," Kesha continued, her tone calm but sharp as a scalpel. "But you seem to have forgotten how the system works. Every device automatically uploads backup data to county servers. She swiped to a new file. The screen lit again, this time with body cam footage, his own perspective, unedited. The view tilted as he stepped in front of her, his voice snarling into the microphone. "Look at this uppity thing thinking she can walk into my courthouse. Time to teach another lesson." The gallery erupted in whispers. Every word he had spoken in private malice was now public record. Walsh covered her mouth with a shaking hand. Rodriguez and Thompson leaned forward, staring in horror at the damning evidence. Kesha's finger hovered over the screen. "And yet both of you," she said, turning to them, testified under oath that Officer Martinez handled the situation with professionalism. "Would you like to revise those statements?" Neither officer responded. The silence condemned them louder than any admission could. "Let me help you," Kesha said, advancing the video until it showed Martinez wrenching her arms behind her back, the cuffs snapping shut. "This is what your professionalism looks like." Rodriguez's hand twitched, as if reaching for his badge, but he thought better of it. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, sweat dripping down his temple. "Officer Martinez," Kesha said, her voice steady, "this court has just witnessed your assault on a federal judge. Your words, your actions, your lies, but the most damning evidence is not that you acted alone. It is that others swore to cover for you." She gestured toward Rodriguez and Thompson. "Perjury, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Do those sound familiar?" Martinez's mouth opened and closed like a drowning man gasping for air. The gallery stared at him with revulsion. Lawyers scribbled frantically, reporters' pens raced across notepads, the clerk's keys hammered like thunder. The very system that had shielded him for years now documented his fall in real time. Kesha leaned forward slightly. Her robe caught the light, the gold trim gleaming. "You told this court earlier that some people only understand authority when it is backed by force. Let me show you another kind of authority, the kind backed by truth." She struck the gavel once. The crack reverberated like a gunshot. Martinez flinched. The courtroom had been flipped inside out. The man who had strutted in as an enforcer of order was now trembling, exposed as a predator masquerading as protector. And it was not just his downfall the court had witnessed. It was the unraveling of an entire system that had enabled him. Each lie revealed, each ally complicit, each silence broken. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. By the time court reconvened, the chamber was overflowing. Reporters packed the back rows, cameras flashing even though photography was forbidden, their pens scratching with a hunger for history. Clerks lined the walls, lawyers who had no hearings that day squeezed into the gallery, and citizens who had heard whispers of what had unfolded now pressed forward for a glimpse. The room had transformed into a theater, and at its center sat Judge Kesha Williams, robed in black with gold trim. The bruise on her cheek, a stark reminder of how the morning began. She did not raise her voice when she began. She didn't need to. Authority wrapped every syllable like iron. "Officer Martinez," she said, her eyes locked on him where he sat slumped at the defendant's table. "In your 15 years of service, you were the subject of 47 formal complaints. 47. Traffic stops turned violent. Teenagers accused you of planting evidence. Doctors arrested outside their own homes. Grandmothers humiliated. 47 voices dismissed as unsubstantial." She opened a thick file, pages marked with red tabs. "You made 1,089 arrests. 87% involved people of color, despite demographics in your patrol area that tell another story. Of those arrests, 432 cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or constitutional violations. 40% of your work collapsed under scrutiny. That is not policing, that is criminal behavior in uniform." The room was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens. Martinez's breathing was shallow, his attorney whispering frantically to him, but he stared straight ahead as though already hollowed out. Kesha's eyes sharpened. "You thought you slapped a powerless woman. What you struck was justice itself." The words echoed like a drumbeat, each spectator feeling the weight in their chest. She reached for another document, this one heavier with symbolism. "When you swore your oath as an officer, you pledged to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, to faithfully and impartially discharge your duties. Do you remember those words? Faithfully, impartially. Today, we see the depth of your betrayal." Her hand rested on the gavel, but she did not strike it yet. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a tone that forced every ear to strain. "You told me this morning to know my place. My place is here, ensuring yours." A ripple surged through the gallery. Some gasped, others nodded, a few clapped before being hushed. The words carried beyond Martinez, beyond the case, as if they were spoken to every officer who had ever abused their badge. Kesha rose from her bench, robe flowing around her, and began to pace slowly, every step deliberate. For years you acted with impunity, certain the system would protect you, certain no one would challenge you. But the truth is not so fragile. It does not break under intimidation. It does not vanish because someone in uniform says it should. Today, the truth has spoken louder than your lies. She returned to her bench and lifted the file high for the courtroom to see. This is not merely your record, Officer Martinez. This is an indictment of every system that enabled you, every superior who ignored complaints, every prosecutor who nodded along, every judge who refused to look deeper. Today this court does more than convict a man. It confronts the rot of complicity. The tension in the air tightened until it felt like glass about to shatter. Kesha set the file down and lifted her gavel. On the charges of assault in the first degree, I find you guilty. On the charge of assault on a judicial officer, I find you guilty. On the charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, I find you guilty. On the charge of perjury, I find you guilty. Each word landed like a hammer, and with each pronouncement, Martinez seemed to shrink further into his chair, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of justice. His attorney put his head in his hands. The gallery sat stunned, the silence broken only by the sound of Martinez's quiet sobs. Then Kesha raised her gavel higher than before. For your crimes, for your abuse of authority, for your betrayal of your oath. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with a crack that shook the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, the sound of pens a frantic chorus. Spectators exhaled in unison, as though a burden they had carried for years had finally been lifted. Some wept, others clapped despite the rules of decorum, the chamber vibrating with the raw release of collective relief. Kesha sat tall, her eyes steady. This judgment is not just about one man, it is a declaration. No badge, no title, no office places anyone above the law. Justice is not blind to power. Justice sees, and today she acts. In that moment, the twist was complete. The trial was no longer about Martinez alone. It was a verdict against the machinery of abuse he represented, a warning shot to every officer who thought silence would protect them. The courtroom had witnessed more than a conviction, it had witnessed a declaration of war against corruption itself. The verdict did not end in that courtroom. It rippled outward, shaking walls far beyond the county line. Within weeks, investigators reopened more than 400 cases tied to Martinez. Men and women who had carried the stain of wrongful convictions walked free. Families reunited after years of silence, their voices trembling with relief as judges declared their records cleared. Newspapers ran headlines not just about one officer's downfall, but about a justice system forced to confront its reflection. Federal oversight arrived swiftly. Body cameras became mandatory, their data automatically stored in secure servers that no excuse of malfunction could erase. Supervisors who had ignored patterns of abuse were removed, prosecutors who had turned blind eyes were questioned, and training programs were rebuilt from the ground up with constitutional rights at their core. Change did not come easily, but it came undeniably. At the courthouse itself, the transformation was made permanent. The old plaque was removed, and in its place new letters gleamed in bronze, Justice Williams Federal Courthouse. The dedication ceremony drew thousands. Clerks, attorneys, citizens, and former defendants stood shoulder to shoulder as Kesha Williams addressed the crowd, her bruise long healed but her words etched forever. Justice delayed is justice denied, she told them. But justice delivered belongs to us all. Cameras captured the moment, and the image of her raising her gavel became an emblem of reform printed in textbooks and painted on murals. Yet the most powerful change was not in the institutions, but in the people themselves. One man, once branded a criminal by Martinez's lies, stood outside the renamed courthouse with tears streaming down his face. He whispered, almost to himself, for the first time, "I believe this system can see us." Those words spread faster than any headline, carried in conversations at dinner tables, in classrooms, in community halls. It was no longer just a story about a corrupt officer. It was about a city that found its courage, a courthouse that found its voice, and a nation reminded that no one is untouchable when truth finally stands. Martinez's sentence marked an ending, but what followed was the beginning of something far greater. Because justice had not only struck back, it had left a legacy. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.